My name is Anna Wallace. I am 28 years old, and it has taken me exactly 15 years to turn the scuffed suitcase my parents packed for me into the legal key that will lock them out of their lives forever. The leather seats of my father's Jaguar smelled like expensive cologne and cold indifference. At 13, I didn't have the words for it, but I felt the weight of the silence pressing against my ribs. I sat in the back, my small hands gripped tight around the handle of a single scuffed suitcase, the only part of my life they deemed essential enough to bring along. "It's just for a few weeks, Anna," my mother, Elena, said without looking back. She was busy checking her reflection in the visor mirror, smoothing her perfect blonde hair, the same shade as mine, though hers always looked like it cost a fortune to maintain. "We just need to recalibrate, get the new venture off the ground without any distractions." Distractions, I whispered. The word tasted like ash. My father, Richard, didn't even offer that much. He kept his eyes on the road as we turned off the paved highway and onto a gravel path that rattled my teeth. The lush, manicured lawns of our suburban estate were gone, replaced with the dense, untamed woods of rural Pennsylvania. We pulled up to a modest, weather-beaten house with a wraparound porch and a yard filled with the rusted skeletons of old engines. This was Uncle Silas's place. My father hadn't spoken to his brother in 5 years. He called him the mechanic. He said it like it was a contagious disease. The car idled, a low, predatory hum against the quiet of the woods. "Out you go," Richard said, finally meeting my eyes in the rearview mirror. There was no sadness there, just a calculation. I was a line item he had decided to cut. I stepped out onto the gravel. The air was thick with the scent of pine needles and wood smoke. Before I could even turn back to say goodbye, the Jaguar was reversing. My mother blew a kiss through the tinted glass, a gesture so hollow it made my stomach ache. Then they were gone, leaving a cloud of dust that coated my shoes. The screen door creaked open. Silas stepped out, wiping grease from his hands with a rag that was more black than white. He was a large man, built like a mountain, with a beard that looked like it had seen better decades. He looked at the dust cloud, then down at me, and then at my single suitcase. "Well, they aren't coming back in 3 weeks, are they, kid?" he asked. His voice was deep, like a low note on a cello. I looked at my scuffed shoes and shook my head. A single tear escaped, hot and stinging. Silas sighed, a heavy frustration aimed at his brother, not at me. He walked down the steps, his boots crunching on the stone. He didn't offer a hug, he wasn't that kind of man, but he reached out and took the heavy suitcase from my hand like it weighed nothing. "Well," he said, gesturing toward the house, "the guest room has a draft, and the floorboards moan like ghosts, but the roof doesn't leak, and there's always bacon in the fridge. Come on, Anna, let's get you settled." As I followed him inside, I looked back at the empty road one last time. I didn't know then that it would take me 15 years to see my parents again, and I didn't know that when I did, I wouldn't be the one standing in the dust. The click of my heels on the polished marble of the lobby sounded like a countdown. 15 years of climbing, of scraping, and of burying the girl with the scuffed suitcase had led me here, to the top floor of a glass and steel monolith overlooking the Philadelphia skyline. In my office, the air was chilled to a precise 68 degrees and smelled faintly of expensive parchment and the double espresso sitting on my desk. I sat down, smoothing the skirt of my charcoal suit, and opened my laptop. My reflection caught in the darkened screen for a second, a sharp, blonde woman with eyes that had learned to hide everything behind a veil of professional indifference. The notification was waiting in my inbox, a private foreclosure alert from the county's high-end residential circuit. Subject: Notice of auction, 1422 Briarwood Lane. My heart didn't skip a beat. Instead, it slowed down, turning cold and heavy in my chest. 1422 Briarwood, the Wallace estate. It was a sprawling neo-Georgian monstrosity with 5 bedrooms, a heated pool, and a mortgage that had finally caught up to my parents' delusions of grandeur. I clicked through the property photos. There was the grand foyer, where my mother used to host charity mixers that cost more to throw than they ever raised. There was the mahogany-paneled library, where my father would sit, sipping scotch and pretending to manage an empire built on credit cards and hope. It looked exactly the same, yet smaller, faded, like a stage set after the lights had been dimmed. "They're drowning, Anna," I whispered to the empty room. I checked the public records, tax liens, 2 second mortgages, and a mountain of consumer debt. They had spent 15 years trying to maintain the image of the family that had been too successful to keep a teenage daughter. Now they were weeks away from the street. I pulled up a secure portal and typed in the credentials for Wallace Holdings LLC, a shell company I had established 3 years ago for this specific, shimmering moment. My phone buzzed. It was a text from Silas. "Transmission's shot on the truck. Might have to close early today. Don't work too hard, kid." I looked at the grease-stained hands I remembered from my childhood, then back at the $4.2 million opening bid on the screen. Silas had given me a home when he had nothing. Richard and Elena had given me a suitcase when they had everything. I didn't hesitate. I entered the maximum bid, a number so high it would effectively shut down any other interested parties. I clicked Submit. The screen flashed. Bid accepted, pending final clearance. A slow, jagged smile spread across my face. I wasn't just buying a house. I was buying the ground they walked on. I was buying the roof over their heads. I reached for my espresso. It was cold, but I drank it anyway. It tasted like victory. The legal transfer took exactly 6 days. 6 days for the name Wallace Holdings LLC to become the official owner of every brick, every shingle, and every blade of grass at 1422 Briarwood Lane. I sat in my office and watched Marcus, my junior associate, through the glass partition. He was 24, eager, and possessed a face so earnest it made people want to tell them their secrets. He was the perfect mask. "Marcus," I called out, pressing the intercom. "Step into my office." He entered, notebook in hand. "Yes, Miss Wallace? I've finalized the acquisition of the Briarwood property. I want you to act as the primary point of contact for the current occupants. They've been granted a month-to-month lease agreement, effective immediately. The rent is significant." I pushed a folder across the desk. Marcus blinked at the number I'd written. It was nearly double the market rate. "Do you think they can afford this? The records show they're in deep water." "That's not our concern," I said, my voice as flat as a dial tone. "They wanted to stay. This is the price of staying. Tell them the owner is a private investor who values discretion. All communication goes through you. Do not, under any circumstances, give me my name." "Understood." 2 days later, the emails started coming. Marcus forwarded them to me in a neat folder labeled Project Briarwood. Reading them felt like watching a movie I'd already seen. "Dear Mr. Marcus, my wife and I are so grateful for the opportunity to remain in our family home. We've poured our souls into this estate. We are currently in the middle of a very high-level consulting deal that will resolve our temporary cash flow issues. We'd love to host the owner for dinner sometime to show our appreciation. Best, Richard Wallace." I leaned back in my chair, a bitter laugh escaping my throat. "Poured our souls into this estate," he'd written. He meant he'd poured his soul into the crown molding while his daughter was sleeping in a room with a draft in Pennsylvania. The next email was from my mother. It was even better. "Mr. Marcus, please let the owner know we are the perfect tenants. We move in the highest circles. In fact, our daughter is a very prominent figure in the real estate world here in the city. We're expecting her to visit soon to help us celebrate our new arrangement." I gripped the edge of my mahogany desk until my knuckles turned white. They were using me. They were using the ghost of the daughter they had discarded to buy themselves social credit with a stranger. They didn't even know what I looked like anymore, yet I was their prominent shield. I typed a quick reply to Marcus. Accept the charm, send the first invoice, no grace periods. The trap was set. They were living in a house of cards, and for the first time in 15 years, I was the wind.
The first rent check didn't just bounce, it evaporated. Marcus walked into my office on the 5th of the month, holding a slip of paper like it was a biohazard. Insufficient funds, Miss Wallace. I called Mr. Wallace, and he spent 20 minutes explaining a banking error involving a Swiss offshore account that's currently frozen for an audit. I didn't even look up from my monitor. Did he now? And what about the late fee? He asked if we could waive it, as a gesture of goodwill between gentlemen. I finally looked up, a cold spark of amusement in my eyes. Tell him the gentleman who owns the house doesn't believe in gestures. Tell him he has 48 hours to wire the full amount plus the $500 late penalty, or the eviction process begins automatically. 48 hours? Isn't that a bit aggressive? Marcus asked, his brow furrowing. It's business, Marcus. Get it done. Once he left, the silence of the office felt stifling. I needed air that didn't smell like air conditioning and ambition. I grabbed my keys and headed for the garage. The drive to Pennsylvania took 2 hours, the scenery shifting from the jagged teeth of the city skyline to the rolling, bruised purple hills of the countryside. As I pulled into Silas's gravel driveway, the sound of a metal grinder echoed through the trees, a harsh, rhythmic screech. I found him under the hood of a rusted-out Ford F-150. He looked older. His hair, once purpured with gray, was now the color of a winter sky. When he saw me, he wiped his forehead with a blackened forearm and managed a weary smile. "Anna, you're early for Sunday dinner," he grunted, wiping his hands on that same old rag. "I just wanted to see you, Silas." I walked over and leaned against the workbench. The shop was a mess of pistons, gaskets, and half-empty cans of motor oil. It smelled of hard work and honest exhaustion. My eyes landed on a stack of unopened envelopes on his desk, utility bills mostly. One was a final notice for his property taxes. "How's the shop, Silas? Really?" He sighed, the sound rattling in his chest. "Parts are getting expensive, kid. Folks around here, they'd rather buy a new piece of junk than fix an old treasure. My back ain't what it used to be either. That lift in the back is acting up again. Costs $5,000 just to look at the damn thing." He said it without bitterness, just a tired acceptance of a man who had worked until his bones were weary. I looked at him, the man who had shared his bacon and his wisdom with a broken 13-year-old girl, and then I thought of Richard and Elena, currently lounging in a house they couldn't afford, lying about Swiss bank accounts to avoid paying for their own vanity. The contrast was a physical ache in my throat. "Don't worry about the lift, Silas," I said softly. "Now, Anna, don't you start." "I'm not starting anything. I'm finishing it." I reached out and squeezed his rough, calloused hand. His skin felt like sandpaper, that it was the only thing that had ever felt like home. When I drove back to the city that night, my heart was no longer cold. It was a furnace. Richard and Elena weren't just tenants who couldn't pay. They were thieves who had stolen 15 years of peace from a man who deserved the world. The 48-hour deadline passed at midnight. No wire transfer arrived. I sat in the dark of my living room, watching the digital clock on the oven flip to 12:01. I pulled out my phone and sent a one-word text to Marcus. File.
The legal system is a slow, grinding mill, but if you know which levers to pull, you can make it move with terrifying precision. By the end of the week, the notice to vacate had been physically taped to the front door of 1422 Briarwood Lane. Marcus told me he'd never heard a man scream as loud as Richard did when he saw the bright orange paper. He called me 15 times in an hour, Marcus said, standing in my doorway. He looked a little pale. He says he knows people. He says he's going to sue the faceless coward who bought the house for harassment. He even threatened to call the governor. Let him call, I said, not looking up from the contract I was reviewing. The governor doesn't pay back rent for deadbeats. Did they mention anything else? Marcus hesitated. Actually, Miss Wallace, they sent an email to your personal account. Or at least they tried to. They sent a message to the general firm address asking for Anna Wallace specifically. They seemed frantic. I felt a cold prickle at the base of my neck. I opened my laptop and navigated to the firm's public inquiry folder. There it was. Subject, Anna. Urgent, family emergency. Anna, darling, we don't know if this is the right way to reach you, but we are in a terrible bind. Some predatory investor has bought our home and is trying to force us out on a technicality. We know how powerful you are in the city now. We are so proud of you. Please, we need you to use your influence. We need a bridge loan, or perhaps you could speak to this Wallace Holdings group. They won't even show their faces. Family sticks together, Anna, always. Please call your father. Family sticks together, I whispered. The irony was so thick I could almost taste it, like pennies and bile. I didn't call. I didn't reply. Instead, I spent the afternoon at a luxury furniture showroom. I wasn't buying anything for myself. I was picking out a leather recliner and a high-end tool chest. I had them scheduled for delivery to Silas's address in 2 weeks, the day after the eviction was scheduled to be completed. As the days ticked down, the weather turned. A cold, biting rain began to wash over the city, mirroring the damp chill I felt every time my phone buzzed with an unknown number. Richard and Elena were no longer just tenants, they were cornered animals. I received a final report from the property management team. They had checked the house's exterior. My parents hadn't started packing. Not a single box was visible through the windows. They truly believed that their status, or perhaps a last-minute miracle from the daughter they'd abandoned, would save them. They were waiting for a savior. I was bringing the storm. Marcus, I said on the eve of the eviction, have the locksmiths ready for 9 a.m. tomorrow and call the sheriff's office to confirm the deputy's arrival. I'll be attending the walkthrough personally. Marcus's eyes widened. You're going? But you said you wanted to remain anonymous. The anonymity has served its purpose, I said, standing up and reaching for my coat. The wool felt heavy and protective. Tomorrow, I want them to see exactly who's taking out the trash. The rain didn't stop. It turned the manicured driveway of Briarwood Lane into a slick, dark ribbon as my SUV pulled up to the curb. I sat in the back seat, watching the rhythmic sweep of the windshield wipers. Outside, the scene was chaos. A white sheriff's cruiser sat idling, its strobe lights splashing red and blue against the white columns of the house. 2 moving trucks were parked at odd angles, and men in neon vests were already hauling a velvet sofa, my mother's favorite, out onto the wet lawn. "Are you ready, Miss Wallace?" the driver asked. "I've been ready for 15 years, I said. I stepped out. The cold rain hit my face, but I didn't reach for an umbrella. I wanted to feel the sting of it. I walked toward the front porch, my heels clicking with lethal intent against the stone. I heard her before I saw her. "You can't do this. Do you know who we are?" Elena's voice was a shrill bird cry. She was standing on the porch, wrapped in a silk robe that was never meant for the outdoors, holding her phone up to record the deputy. "This is a violation of our civil rights. We are being targeted. This will go viral. You'll be ruined." Richard was next to her, his face a mottled, angry purple. He was shouting at Marcus, who looked like he wanted to vanish into the floorboards. "Where is he?" Richard bellowed, gesturing at the house. "Where is the coward who bought this place? Tell him to come face me like a man." "He isn't coming," I said. my voice cutting through the rain and the shouting like a blade. The group went silent. Richard and Elena turned toward me. At first, there was only confusion. They saw a wealthy blonde woman in a designer coat, someone they recognized as part of their world. Elena actually lowered her phone, her expression shifting from rage to a desperate, predatory hope. "Anna," she whispered, her eyes searching my face. "Anna, thank God, you got our message. Tell these people to stop. Tell them there's been a mistake." She moved to hug me, her arms outstretched, the scent of her expensive, cloying perfume hitting me like a physical blow. I stepped back, my movement sharp and clinical. "There's no mistake, Elena." The use of her first name made her flinch. Richard stepped forward, his bravado flickering. "Anna, listen, we can explain the finances. We just need a little time to—" "You've had 15 years," I interrupted. I looked past them into the house. I could see the foyer where I had stood with my suitcase, waiting for a goodbye that never really came. I signaled to the driver of my SUV. He hopped out, opened the trunk, and pulled out a battered, dusty object. He walked up the steps and handed it to me. It was the scuffed, brown suitcase, the one I'd taken to Silas's. I had kept it in the back of my closet, a relic of the girl I used to be. I dropped it on the porch between us. It landed with a heavy, hollow thud. "What is this?" Richard asked, staring at the old luggage as if it were a bomb. "This is the only thing you ever gave me that was actually yours, and now I'm giving it back. You have 20 minutes to pack what you can fit inside it. Whatever is left on the lawn after that belongs to the city's disposal crew." The silence that followed was only broken by the sound of the rain and the heavy breathing of my father. The realization finally hit them. The predatory investor, the faceless coward, the owner who had refused their pleas. It was me. The silence on the porch was deafening, save for the rhythmic thwack thwack of the movers' boots and the steady drumming of the rain. My mother's face seemed to age a decade in seconds. The makeup she had carefully applied to look distinguished for the cameras was beginning to run, gray streaks carving paths through her foundation. "Anna?" Richard croaked. His voice lacked its usual booming authority. He looked down at the scuffed suitcase, then back at me. This is cruel. We're your flesh and blood." "Funny," I said, tilting my head slightly. "I remember the word you used back then wasn't blood, it was liability. You told me I was too expensive to maintain. You treated me like a bad investment you needed to dump before the market crashed." I stepped closer, my umbrella-less hair plastered to my forehead, but I felt more powerful than I ever had in a boardroom. "Today, Richard, you're the one on the balance sheet, and I'm writing you off." "You can't just throw us out in the rain," Elena wailed, clutching her silk robe tighter. She looked toward the moving truck, where a worker was currently carrying a floor-length gilded mirror, the one she used to admire herself in for hours. "That's my antique. That's worth more than your life." "Actually," I said, checking my watch, "it's worth about 3 months of the rent you didn't pay. It stays. Everything stays unless it fits in that bag." The next 20 minutes were a frantic, pathetic display. I stood like a statue, watching as the two people who had once dictated my entire world scrambled to save pieces of their vanity. Richard tried to shove a collection of designer watches into the suitcase. I had the deputy remind him that luxury goods purchased with credit cards currently under litigation were subject to seizure. Elena tried to hide jewelry in her robe pockets until the deputy stepped in. They were small. They were so incredibly small. As the clock hit the mark, the movers finished the main floor. The house, the great Wallace estate, was being gutted. It looked like a carcass being picked clean. "Time's up," I said. The deputy gestured toward the driveway. Richard picked up the suitcase, the same one I had carried away at 13, and began to walk down the steps. His shoulders were slumped, his expensive loafers soaking up the rainwater. Elena followed, sobbing into her hands, her carefully curated life literally sitting in a pile of wet cardboard on the lawn. I didn't feel the rush of heat I expected. I didn't feel a surge of joy. I felt a profound, cooling sense of nothing. The space they had occupied in my heart for 15 years, a space filled with jagged glass and resentment, was suddenly quietly empty. I turned to Marcus, who was watching from the edge of the porch, looking slightly shock-shelled. "List it," I told him. "The house? But Miss Wallace, you just bought it. Don't you want to, I don't know, walk through, reclaim the space?" I looked at the front door, the heavy oak I used to hide behind when they were fighting about money. I looked at the windows that always seemed like prison bars. "There's nothing here worth reclaiming, Marcus. Sell it to the highest bidder. Take the commission, then wire the rest of the profit to the account I set up for Silas Vance." I walked down the steps, past my parents who were standing by the curb, trying to hail a rideshare while their designer chairs sat in the mud. I didn't look at them. I didn't need to see the ending of their story. I was too busy starting my own.
The air in rural Pennsylvania didn't smell like damp marble or desperation. It smelled of seasoned oak, wood smoke, and the sharp, clean scent of pine. 2 weeks had passed since the rain-soaked afternoon at Briarwood Lane. I pulled my SUV into Silas's driveway, but this time the gravel didn't rattle my teeth. I'd paid to have the lane graded and topped with fresh stone. The old shop looked different. The sagging roof had been replaced with sturdy charcoal shingles, and a brand-new industrial-grade hydraulic lift, painted a brilliant, defiant red, stood gleaming in the center of the bay. I found Silas in the back garden of the small cottage I'd purchased for him just down the road. He was sitting in the oversized leather recliner I'd sent, a glass of iced tea in one hand and a newspaper in the other. He looked younger. The deep lines around his eyes seemed to have softened, no longer etched by the constant worry of how to keep the lights on. "You're making a habit of showing up unannounced, kid," he said, though his voice was thick with affection. He gestured to the porch swing next to him. "Sit. The birds are putting on a show today." I sat, the wood of the swing creaking rhythmically. For a long time, we just watched the sun dip behind the tree line, turning the sky into a bruised palette of orange and gold. "I saw the papers," Silas said quietly, not looking at me. "The Wallace estate sold, for a record price, too." "Every cent of the profit is in your retirement fund, Silas, and the shop is officially yours. No more leases, no more predatory loans, just you and your tools." Silas sighed, a long, shaky breath. He reached out and patted my hand with a palm that would always be stained with the honest work of a mechanic. "You didn't have to do that, Anna. I took you in because you were family, not for a payday 15 years later." "I know," I whispered, leaning my head against his shoulder. "That's exactly why I did it. You were the only one who didn't see me as a transaction." My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out. A new, unblocked number. "Anna, please, we're staying in a motel. Your father's health. We need help. Just one more chance to be a family." I looked at the screen. A year ago, a message like that would have made my blood boil, or my throat tighten with a mix of guilt and rage. But as I sat there in the quiet of the woods, I felt nothing. No anger, no satisfaction, just a vast, cooling indifference. I didn't block the number. I didn't reply. I simply swiped the notification away, letting it vanish into the digital ether. "Everything okay?" Silas asked, sensing the shift in my posture. "Everything is perfect," I said, tucking the phone away. I watched a hawk circle high above the clearing, free and sharp against the fading light. The scuffed suitcase was gone, the house was sold, and the debt was finally settled. I wasn't the girl in the dust anymore. I was exactly where I was meant to be. I was home.